Hey everyone, welcome to day 24 of the Spark Change Challenge, and there's only a week to go now, which is quite unbelievable. So in this last week, as promised, we're going to delve a little deeper into each of the six domains, and we're kicking that off with the safety and boundaries domain, which is, as we talked about last night, so important to all the other domains. If we don't have that sense of safety, it's very hard to be spontaneous. It's very hard to be playful. It's very hard to be able to take care of your physical health and prioritize wants versus needs, and to demonstrate that kindness to yourself. Like the safety is really quite crucial, and it is often the one that healthcare workers and psychologists and therapists in particular are really poor at. So I thought I would share a little bit of some of the work that I've found helpful for me personally, and that some of my clients have found helpful when it comes to really setting up some of these mind shift changes in terms of, really saying or realizing that when you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else, and being okay to say no when you need to, whether that's, enforcing a cancellation fee, whether that's putting clients in before and after your normal sessions to help them out, whether that's negotiating, your percentage split as a contractor or as the director, whatever it might be. Those boundaries and that safety stuff is much, much easier if you have an internal sense of safety and protection. So, yeah, as promised, we'll go a little bit deeper. And I've got a really lovely meditation, or an audio meditation, to share with you in the email, and I'll put it into the Tools of the Trade Therapy Facebook group as well. But this meditation is all about getting in touch with the inner child, or the little self, or the vulnerable parts, or however we want to refer to it. I'm going to call it the inner child, which I must admit, when I first started doing therapy as a therapist, I really thought the inner child stuff was all a little bit, I thought it was a bit wanky, I'll be quite honest. People talked about their inner children and these vulnerable parts, and I'd sort of, same as self-care, I'd kind of roll my eyes and go, yeah, yeah, okay. I was very, very cognitive. I was very, very in my head. And it wasn't until I started seeing the the blocks and the barriers to lasting change for long-term issues that I started going, okay, there's more to this. I'm missing something, and started exploring some of that. Well, originally it was schema work, and then getting a bit more into sort of somatic stuff and family systems, and realizing that harshness that I was greeting the mere idea of inner child work with was how I dealt with my own vulnerabilities. I squash them down, pretend they're not there, minimize them, mock them, do anything but actually deal with them with any kind of compassion. At least that was the way that I did it. And I realized how often I was doing that, and how often that was coming up for my clients who had really long-term, personality disorders, or, long-term treatment resistant depression, or severe anxiety disorders, just about anything really, um, ongoing relationship problems, it, you name it. But I noticed they all had this tendency to minimize vulnerability, to despise vulnerability in some cases. So I'm going to tell you two stories based off this. One is from a client, and one is from my own. And I do this for contrast, and also to make sure that I'm maintaining confidentiality as much as possible, and sharing my own story. Well, I'm fine with that. And this other one is enough kind of removed from anyone that can be identified, that I think it is okay to share. So in this imagery meditation that I'll be sharing with you guys later, you basically come to meet your inner child, your little self, and they're in a vulnerable or a potentially vulnerable situation. And what happened in my case was, when I tried to, as the therapist was directing me, as I tried to sort of comfort the child, as I tried to comfort the representation of the inner child, she wouldn't let me. She didn't want me anywhere near her. She didn't trust me either. And I was really sort of confused about that at first. But then I realized I was also then getting angry. It's almost like, oh, come on, you little shit. Why won't you trust me? um, I can laugh about it now. This is many years ago. But what I what I came to understand and realize was she had very little reason to trust me. I had always treated her the same way that the caregivers had treated me and her in the past, and I'd just replicated it. I'd replicated the critical voices. I'd replicated the shutting it up and it's not important, and all the things that had sort of created or sort of maintain that vulnerable part. I was doing all exactly the same thing. So why the hell should she trust me? And it took quite a while to build that trust. This is not the case for everybody. When you guys, if you guys do this meditation after this, then you might have, I suppose, the prototypical experience of the little child just embracing you, and you guys are all happy and you have a nice chat and everything's good and you just feel really nice and good afterwards. If you don't, then I highly recommend, if you have a different reaction to the inner child, then I highly recommend talking to your own therapist about that, because it's very, very hard. Any of this self-care stuff that we've spent this last nearly month talking about, any of this stuff, if you don't have a sense of internal safety, and you only get that sense of internal safety if you can be safe and accepting and comforting and nurturing of all of your parts. If you don't have that, then any of this stuff that we've been talking about is just not going to work. You're not going to be able to maintain it, even when you have spent many years in therapy working on that and developing that trust and developing that relationship. It's still really hard. So if you don't have that foundation, I think it's going to be next to impossible. So if you do this meditation and you find it brings up a lot of things, that the child doesn't automatically trust you, or you have, as in the case of the client that I'm going to talk about, or you have an unexpected reaction to the child or to the vulnerable parts, then please do seek out your own therapy, and with someone versed in schema or EMDR, attachment informed EMDR in particular, internal family systems, but any of the therapies that go deeper than CBT. So that was my experience of sort of meeting with that inner child part, and having her just not trust me, and realizing that was because I had done nothing to earn that trust. And I still let her down at times, but we have a bit of an ongoing dialogue now, um, and we usually work it out. So for this client that I was going to talk about, I'm talking about my experience and what happens if the inner child doesn't necessarily trust you. But in this case, the client's reaction to meeting the inner child was actually quite violent. She became enraged at the vulnerability. She became enraged at the inner child part and pretty much wanted to destroy it. And it was a very strong, very strong, very visceral reaction. And she became quite scared then, of like, I'm some sort of monster. I want to, destroy a destroy a child in an imagery exercise. What the hell is wrong with me? But again, this was just, and it was so useful to bring this stuff out into the open, because up until that point she had been very much of the belief that her parents were perfect and had given her all the love and nurturance and support and everything that a child needs. That had not been my view of the situation up until this point. I'd seen a lot of things that made me concerned about the type of childhood she'd experienced, and this exercise was a way to sort of bring that to the front of, well, where Where did you learn to respond to vulnerability in that way? And this is someone who, demonstrated a tremendous amount of caring for other people, for other animals in their work. There was no way in hell this was someone who actually wanted to do physical harm to something more vulnerable than they were. This was just a really strong reaction to all of the messages she'd received as an actual child, coming out and being directed towards that in the same way, because she had aligned so much with the caregivers in terms of, not allowing, weakness, not allowing vulnerability. Because she thought that what they did and the way they did things was right, she had adopted that internally without even necessarily realizing it. So she was fine with other people being vulnerable, but she was not okay to display any vulnerability herself. And you cannot feel safe if that's the case, because of course we're going to be vulnerable. Of course we're going to get sick. Of course we're going to have bad days. Of course we're going to want to connect with other human beings. And to do that, you've got to allow a certain amount of vulnerability. We need that vulnerability to function as fully fledged humans. And if we can't do that safely, if we can't do that without either, dismissing or negating or generally belittling the vulnerable parts or actually attacking them, what what the hell are we teaching that inner child? What the hell are we teaching ourselves about what's safe, about um, what boundaries we're entitled to and we're allowed to have? I think of it sometimes like the shark cage work. If anyone's familiar with the idea of this, or the shark cage metaphor for family violence work, I might put a copy of that into the group as well. But that idea that, you know, it's not that there are people who attract abusers. It's that there are people who have certain vulnerabilities, that have gaps in their shark cage that allow sharks to get in without the alarms ringing. And that's usually because they've been raised in a way, or they've been raised by parents who don't have their own shark cage and never taught them how to build theirs properly. And it's a very similar idea, a very similar concept. If you didn't have that good enough parenting growing up, you didn't have that good enough modeling of what is um, what is a reasonable response to vulnerability, what is a reasonable response to being scared, to being angry, to being, any of the 1,001 emotions that a kid will display in any one day. If we don't have a good model for that, and we end up repeating that pattern at almost at best just with ourselves, at worst with everybody else around us, with our own children, like it's a recipe for danger, not safety. And I think you can probably see, if that's the case, if you can't allow for any vulnerability, if you can't allow, and if you've never experienced actual safety, it makes it next to impossible then to improve your safety or increase your feelings of safety by putting in boundaries, because you'll feel like either you don't deserve the boundaries or you don't need the boundaries because you're invulnerable, and neither of those are true. So that's my deeper dive into safety and boundaries for this evening. I'll put in a copy. I'm going to write it down so I don't forget. So we'll put in a copy of the imagery and the shark cage metaphor, because that is all just, that's a really, really good way of talking about boundaries and safety, from the family violence context, but in a way I think that makes a lot of sense for what we're talking about here as well. So thank you very much for joining me, and I will look forward to speaking to you tomorrow night for our deeper dive into physical health and body care. Take care, everyone. Bye.